Well, one of the weird things about me, the fact that I work, as I said, so many fields, theater, print, television, documentary, is that I've actually never had a writing class in my life. I've never taken a writing course whatsoever. I woke up one morning, was a playwright. I woke up one morning, I was writing a novel, almost all of that. And I have to say, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as an Indigenous person growing up in a First Nations environment, I was surrounded by storytelling. And not just the traditional stories that a lot of people imagine with Native people, but just sitting around with family. I lived right across from my grandparents. A couple times a week during the summer, they'd have big bonfires, and cousins, family, whatever, would come sit around the bonfire and tell funny stories about people we knew, about the family, etc.
Kwe Ninda Louise Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. But on this podcast, you're going to get an education of a totally different kind, one that's enriched by the cultures, insights, and actual lived experiences of Indigenous authors, artists, musicians, and academics, as well as leaders, activists, land defenders, and water protectors on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And the forecast for today's podcast is cold. Very cold. So grab a sweater and stay tuned. Welcome back to the Warrior Life Podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater, and I am so happy to be able to welcome to the show today the infamous and award-winning artist, author, journalist, playwright, filmmaker, storyteller, comedian, but sometimes serious, Hayden Taylor. He is like one of the most amazing people I've ever met. And let me tell you, I have literally been waiting for the day when I could have this blue-eyed Indian, yes, they actually exist, a blue-eyed Indian on my podcast. I'm a huge fan. And this guy has literally been everywhere and done everything. I think he's been in, multiple dozens of countries. He's performed stand-up comedy at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. He's written no less than, I think at last count, a bazillion books, something like that.
A little short of that.
Including Cold and several others that we'll talk about today. He's worked on numerous documentaries, including Cottagers and Indians, and his most recent one, I think my favorite, The Pretendians. And we can't forget his TV series that he works on with APTN, Going Native. And of course, he and I were just talking about, he has been nominated for, I don't know how many prestigious awards, like the Governor General's Awards, the Gemini Awards, and he's actually won some of those. So in 2010, he won the Ontario Premier's Award for Creative Arts and Design, and in 2012, the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Award. Drew's resume is longer than my first book. That's literally how accomplished he is. Thank you so much for being on the show, Hayden Taylor.
As we say in my reserve, grazie.
Grazie. Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, I'm excited because, I have been harassing you, I think, on every social media platform there is to get you to come on my podcast, because you're very well requested. When listeners write in and say, here's people I want to hear from. Oh, it's like Hayden Taylor. Oh, and let's talk about this book, Cold by Hayden Taylor. So there you go. But before we get into all of this, effectively, the interrogation or interview, as I might like to call it, and I know you're busy for time, perhaps you could introduce yourself and a little bit about your community, because after all, the first step in this show is I have to show that you're not a Pretendian.
You want me to hold up my status card? uh, what are they? Card carrying Indian. Well, I'm born, raised, and for the most part, live on my First Nation community, the Curve Lake. I have we have a place in both Curve Lake and in Toronto. I like to say I live in Curve Lake, but have a cottage in Toronto. Um, and I'm what you call a contemporary storyteller. That is to say, in today's society, there are so many different ways to tell stories. We've gone from telling stories around the campfire and across the kitchen table to telling stories on radio, television, theater, print, documentary, and even video games today have deep and intricate narratives in them. And I like exploring all of them. For me, part of the fun is not just coming up with an interesting story, but what's the best way to tell that story? So that's why I work in so many different fields.
Well, so are you trying to say that you're developing a video game right now?
I was actually contacted by a company in California who was interested in doing a post-apocalyptic North American video game where a couple of the survivors was an Indigenous tribe, and so I talked with them for a while about it, but it wasn't really something I was interested in, so it didn't end up going anywhere.
Well, if you do, I want to be in the video game.
We can put you in one of those bizarrely impractical leather bikinis.
Oh God. Yeah, so I can pretend I look like something I don't. Oh, and it has to be camo, right? It's gotta be camo.
No, not buckskin.
Oh, okay. Camo buckskin, maybe. Oh, that's a hoot. That would be interesting, but who knows what's gonna come from you. But you know, when I was thinking about all of the things that I wanted to ask you today, I was thinking, okay, there's like a lot of like personal things that I want to know about, but before we kind of get into that, I'd love to know a little bit about your journey because often when listeners ask for people to come on, sometimes they're the youth, for example, and they want to know how did people get to where they are? Like, did they start out that way? So, when you and I were at the Pretendian panel at Wabano a few weeks ago, you talked about what it was like growing up on Curve Lake and wondering if you could share about that a little bit because there's so many Native people that listen to this podcast.
Yeah, well, one of the weird things about me, the fact that I work, as I said, so many fields, theater, print,
Yeah.
television, documentary, is that I've actually never had a writing class in my life. I've never taken a writing course whatsoever. I woke up one morning, was a playwright. I woke up one morning, I was writing a novel, almost all of that. And I have to say, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, as an Indigenous person growing up in a First Nations environment, I was surrounded by storytelling, and not just the traditional stories that a lot of people imagine with Native people, but just sitting around with family. I lived right across from my grandparents. A couple times a week during the summer, they'd have big bonfires, and cousins, family, whatever, would come sit around the bonfire and tell funny stories about people we knew, about the family, etc. And I grew up listening to all this. And the thing about it, like a good story is it has a universal structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are characters in it, and it's a journey. And I think because I grew up hearing these stories, for me, I just had a natural affinity to understanding how to tell stories. And whether it's a play, a movie, a book, or whatever, storytelling in its own way is structure. And I think that kind of environment taught me the importance the importance of structure in storytelling. So that when I went to theater, I learned the structure of theater. When I started writing novels, I learned the structure of novels, television shows, etc. So the fact that the storytelling tradition was always there, we just had to apply it to different ways of telling that story. And I think, if anything, that was my, I don't know, superpower, for lack of a better term. I think we all grew up with, if you can tell a good joke, a longer joke, that has structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a flow. It has an arc, all of that. If you can tell a decent joke, you can write a story once you understand the structure of how you want to tell that story.
Well, that's really good. I can't tell jokes, so I'm wondering what that means for me. I'm in so much trouble, maybe, or maybe you need to do a writing class and actually teach the rest of us what all
Well, you
these
see, that
structures
is the
are.
problem. That is the problem. Because I've never been taught how to write, I keep
Right.
getting asked to mentor or teach a writing course, and it's like I don't know how I do what I do. I can teach
Right.
people how to write like me, but the world is not ready for nothing but a whole generation of DHT writers. That'd be scary.
Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah, I get it. I get it. It's kind of like just you've lived it, you've heard it, and you just apply it. And as opposed to if you go to writing school, they're like, first do this, and then do this, and then do
Exactly.
this. And
And
yeah, okay.
there's a good and a bad to that, because I remember my very first couple plays when I was writer in residence back in the late '80s, if you can believe that, 1,000 years ago, for Native Earth Performing Arts, and then for the Ojibway Theater Group on Manitoulin Island. My first couple plays, how can I put this? It would be like your first year drama class writing. But
Oh,
because Indigenous theater was so popular and everybody was hungry for it for during what I refer to as the contemporary Indigenous literary renaissance, that they got published, and I actually won an award for them. And I look back today and I see them and I sort of wince, going, "Oh my God, I can't believe they published this." So my career started with stuff that probably would have remained in a classroom in university. So and I spent 2 years with the Ojibway Theater Group located on Manitoulin Island, and I wrote 6 plays for them. So I almost like an internship up there, learning the bones of theater while doing it and while seeing it published and or produced and all that. And when you see it, when you actually see it on stage and everything that can go wrong, that teaches you a lot.
I feel like your university has been the university of trial and error in public. So,
Of doing it, of just going out and doing it, and being pushed to do it. Because I never would have been a playwright, except Thompson Highway phoned me up one day and asked me to be the writer in residence for Native Earth because they had a grant, nobody else was available, and he'd heard of me kicking around, and he asked me to be the writer in residence. I wasn't interested in theater. I thought theater artists were pretentious, and I still do. But I needed the money. I had a very hungry landlord that liked to be fed on a regular basis.
oh my.
So I became I joined up, learned how to write plays, and I haven't left since. Same with writing for television. I was writing an article on adapting Native stories into television and film format. I talked to story editors who worked on television series all across Canada. One of them
Wow.
suggested I submit some story ideas just for the hell of it, which consisted of just a 2-page
Yeah.
outline. I did that. They bought one, and I had to write it. I got an email from a publisher who's saying they've been following my theater career and my writing of articles and magazines, and thought I'd be that I might be interested in writing a novel for them. And I said, I've never written a novel. I don't do novels. That's adult writing. That's big guy writing, big pants writing. But they said they would commission me. They'd pay me in advance. So suddenly I was writing a novel. So it's basically serendipity, shall we say.
Well, that's cool though. I mean, there's all different ways that people get to where they are, and the fact that you've kind of, you know, for better or worse or in between, having to do this in public, and then you get to be your own critic, I guess, when you see it or things that are happening. And, and then it makes me wonder. So one of the questions we always get here is people want to know, did you always want to be a fireman? Did you always want to be a police officer? And like, when did you know that your future would be in film and television? Like, were you always creative as a child? Were you performing plays for all your aunties and uncles at parties?
No, 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 no. I was, and to a certain extent, still am painfully shy. In grade 8, we had to do public speeches, and I remember being given that, and I hated it. I'd break out in hives. My hands would get cold. I'd get nauseous. I hated public speaking, being the center of attention, so badly that when grade 8, I got up one morning. My mother had already left for work. Got up, decided I can't do this. I went to the archway that separated the living room from the kitchen and banged my head on the side of the archway on the corner until the whole side of my head was swollen. And I stayed home that day, and I told my mother I got up, tripped, hit my head. And that's how much public speaking terrified me. So the whole being in a public eye at one time was horrifying. So growing up on the reserve, I fast realized as an up and coming writer that you have more control over the universe you create than the universe you live in. And that really appealed to me. So I wanted to be a writer, but unfortunately I didn't get much support. I went to my grade 11 English teacher, asked him about, is it possible to make a living from creative writing? And without even looking up from his desk, he said, no, not really. And my mother didn't want me to be a writer because she said writing wouldn't get me anywhere. So I gave up. I gave up wanting to be a writer for most of my teen years and early 20s. But I was always interested in the arts because artists create amazing things from just imagination. So I went into the arts world without being an artist. I was a hanger-on, I'm with the band, or if you'll pardon the term, a wannabe. And so I was a trainee producer with CBC Radio. I did the location sound on documentaries. I worked for the Canadian Native Arts Foundation, now called Inspire, and all these different things. So I was always there, but not as an artist. And I was in my mid-20s before, not so much, I always find this part interesting, not so much a case of me finally finding my art finally tracked me down, kicked me in the ass and said, you are a writer. So at the age of 25, I found myself writing an episode of a show called The Beachcombers. And as I said, I was 25. I had never written anything before. I wrote it. It was, and from there, I did Street Legal, North of 60. Then I got into theater, and so on and so on and so on.
Oh, and so on and so on and so on. And you would have to keep saying so ons for many, many times, like an exponential amount, because that's
it's
literally
a complex
so
world
amazing.
out there and a fun world.
Well, it makes me think because when I was in grade 4, I started writing a scary novel about worms that were going to invade cities and eat humans. But I stopped this little kid novel midway because I thought, you know what? I'm going to write a documentary book about aliens. And neither were ever published. But always since I was a kid, I thought someday I want to publish a book, like a really cool story. So when I published my books, like, they're not novels or anything. My kids were like, Mom, you did it. You accomplished it. You published books. And I was like, no, those are just like native politics. That's not like a story, a really cool, scary story or something. And here you are. And so, I mean, I know you started at age 25, but I have to think, were you ever contemplating this as a kid, potentially writing books like when you were really young? Because when I heard you talk at the conference or the panel we did, you were saying how much you hated writing books. So I'm like, okay, at what point did he realize he hated writing books so much that he would go on a book writing rampage and literally write dozens and dozens of books?
All right, I'm going to use well, first of all, I'm going to give 2 reasons. One, a wonderful saying by Dorothy Parker, a writer from the 1940s and 50s. The Algonquin Round Table group of artists in New York, who said, I hate writing, but I love having written. Right? You write a television show, you see it on television, it's amazing. You write a play, you see your name on the poster, or you actually see the play and people laughing and crying. You write a book, you're walking through an airport and you see people reading your book. There's a rush to it that is amazing. There are a lot of artists who claim I don't do it for that or whatever, and you don't do it for that rush. You do it because there's a story in you that needs to be told. But that's the gravy on the meal. The other thing is, when I say I hate writing, I'm going to use the most overused, exhausted annoying metaphor that's been used is the fact that, and I heard somebody use this as an example, so I'm copying it. It's like giving birth. It's not fun at the time. It's painful. It's annoying. You're going through all this sort of stuff, and you're probably swearing at while doing it. Never again, never again, never again. But once it's done, and you see the final product in your arms, you sort of look at it and go, "Well, that wasn't that bad. I would do that again." When you see the final product, so that's sort of the cliche I embrace when I'm writing.
Well, something has to get you through. I mean, because you just
Yeah.
keep doing it over and over and over again. It's like there is light somewhere at the end of this
Well,
tunnel. I
my
just need
partner
to keep
says when
going.
I'm writing, the best way. She once phoned me when I was amidst of something. I was going, "Yeah, what? Okay, yeah, fine, gotta go, bye." And she says it's like putting a blanket around me where I'm literally in that world, and the good and the bad happens. And as I've gotten older, I'm actually beginning to enjoy it more than when I was young. Young, it was it's like working out, right? When you're developing the muscles, it's harder to do it. But once you've been doing it for a while, it becomes natural, and you understand it, and you begin to enjoy it a bit more.
Okay, well, this is what I have to look forward to, though I would have to write for the rest of my life to try to catch up to you. And I'm thinking, you know what? Let's not make it a competition. I'll be happy if I make my first scary book at some point in
You do
time.
that, I'll have to get a law degree.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I don't know. That would be also very
So
scary in
wait,
that
I
context.
do have a doctorate of laws, though. Does that count?
Yes, we will let that count. We will
I'm
let
a
that
good,
count.
and it's from your province. I got it from Mount Allison.
New Brunswick. Oh, wow. Well, there you go. That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so now let's get into the controversy, the deep, deep controversy. And I forgot to tell you that there are some questions that you can't skip. You know, this is like you
Okay.
don't get to call a friend on this one. What on earth made you decide to enter into the controversial Facebook war that would be started by doing a documentary on Pretendians?
Well, okay. It started with an editor of the arts section of the Globe and Mail. As you may or may not know, for about the last 10 years or 12 years, I used to do regular columns for the Globe and Mail on Indigenous issues, specifically art issues, but not necessarily art issues. The editor then was very liked my work and liked getting my 2 cents on all these things that were happening. And it all started with Mr. Joseph Boyden when this whole thing happened. And it was so funny. I was actually on the beach in Mexico when Jorge Barrera's article came out about him. And the editor phoned me on the beach saying, "This has just happened. Everybody's a buzz about it. Would you like to write an article about the issue?" And I'm like, "But I'm on the beach right now." And he pestered me, and I said, "Oh, very well." So I went back up, and I spent 2 days working on an article on sort of my take on the Pretendian issue on him. And the thing being, right, I knew him because we'd done book tours together. We'd gone to festivals, etc. So we were book tour buddies, for lack of a better term. And so I wrote it, sent it off, and it got a lot of good response. And then life went on, and I think about a month or two later, he came back. Joseph came back with that letter trying to justify what he'd done. And I don't know, I think I was on the road or something, and I get another phone email saying, "This is his official response. Would you like to respond to it?" And I'm like, I'm in the middle of stuff. So anyways, I did that. And then, of course, Michelle Latimer happened. So I kept getting asked for my 2 cents on all this stuff, and I gave it, especially somebody who looks like me, right? One of my first books that I published was a series of autobiographical essays exploring my life as a white passing Indigenous man. And the title of the book was called "Funny, You Don't Look Like One." Observations of a Blue-Eyed Ojibway. And it was so successful, so popular, because I'm exploring these important issues, but filtered through humor. And it was sold out. And I had to do another book, more essays exploring the issue. And it became a book called Funny You Don't Look Like One Too, Observations of a Blue-Eyed Ojibway. So anyways, so all this was happening, and I was like writing stuff about it because it's an interesting topic, one above all else. I wasn't doing it just because I was asked to or because I was paid to. Identity is always interesting, and it's always been at the forefront of a lot of my books. My very first play and book, Toronto Dreamers Rock, was about 3 teenage boys that go to the top of a rock where Dreamers Rock, located on Birch Island, which is where young boys would go to have vision quests for thousands of years. And so you've got 3 boys, native boys, from 3 different time periods, one from 100 years ago, one from now, one from 400 years in the future. My very first play, and it dealt with, at the end, when they came down from Dreamers Rock, they all had their own understanding of what being native means to them in their time period. So this has always been a subject of interest to me. So anyways, I'm doing all these articles, and gradually, in the midst of all this, I developed a friendship with a producer, a guy named Paul Kemp, who was aware of many of my interests, one of them being the German fascination with native culture. I've done 20 lecture tours of Germany. They're absolutely enamored with native people, or what they think are native people. So we did I wrote a play about it called The Berlin Blues. And then we did a documentary about it called Searching for Winnetou. And it was a humorous take on this German fascination. And then after that, we did another documentary about a play I did, Cottagers and Indians, about the wild rice controversy on my reserve, about a gentleman named James Wheatung who plants wild rice in these lakes that the non-native, the settler cottagers and homeowners have a problem with because it interferes with swimming, fishing, boating, etc. But the documentary on a larger scale dealt with native, non-native conflicts happening in communities across Canada. But the Pretendian issue would just not go away. There was Carrie Barassa. There is Mr. Lovelace from Queens, etc. Every 4 or 5 months, something or somebody would pop up, and it was like a snowball. And then my producing partner just said, we should do something on that. And I'm thinking, yeah, this will be interesting. We could do it. How do we do it? And we just went ahead and did it. And we tried to be as humorous as we could with the topic. One of my aunts who saw the wild rice documentary looked at me after having seen the German one and said, I was hoping it would be funnier. We tried to make the Pretendian one as humorous as possible. So we dealt with all this, and we left so much. There was so much we could have covered, did cover, but couldn't put on the documentary just because we only had 44 minutes, because it's such a broad topic, so many interesting aspects. I forget the name of the community, but the Indigenous community, new community in Newfoundland, right? And then there's all the new Métis organizations popping up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so much we could have gone into, but we just didn't have the time. So that's basically how we ended up doing the Pretendians. That they kept popping up, and there's a constant interest in them, and there was a lot of misinformation. We tried to sort of set the record straight about what a Pretendian is, and as much as possible. I mean, it's still a complex issue. It's not done with yet. It keeps happening over and over again.
Did you get any feedback? Like, I know lots of people loved the documentary, but did you get any of the crankies writing and saying, wait a second, why did you say whatever you said?
From both sides. I had a lot of people get angry with me because we weren't angry enough. We weren't accusatory. I had one guy say that there was one person he's personally individually wanted outed, and the fact that we didn't aim the whole documentary at that person was a cop-out, and it invalidated the whole documentary, and we should have spent the whole time outing people. And on the other hand, I had somebody basically saying, who gave me the authority to be the gatekeeper, to basically say who's native, who's non-native? I'm just a white passing, scum sucking, Pretendian hunter.
Oh, wow. 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 I get that all the time. And in fact, when the crankies write me, they're like, and you're just a Pretendian. You're not even a member of a First Nation. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I am. But how do you argue with, yes, you are. No, you're not. Yes, you are. No, you're not.
I mean, one time I got one of those, and I was like sitting, I was sitting at the kitchen table in my mother's house, which is now my house, drinking coffee from a mug on my reserve. My uncle is chief. I'm like half a kilometer from the graveyard where my grandparents, 10 of my aunts and uncles are buried. And it's like, I don't know how much more Indigenous you need to be.
Well, you could have been wearing feathers in your hair or something. I mean, there's always that.
Gutting a moose.
Yeah, hunting a moose. Yeah, I know. And that's all you do. That's all you do. Just hunt moose. But yeah, no, I mean, that was so great. And I know when I met you at the conference, my first question was, are you doing a sequel to that? Are you going to make a series on this? And you're like, wait a second.
I think there's enough new material out there to explore it. But the question is, it was supposed to be the way we approach these documentaries is a journey of exploration, to understand. And I think that's what we did in the first one. There are just new examples out there. I don't know if there's any new understanding, any new journey to go on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people are still talking about it, right? And it gave people who don't know anything about the issue, who don't know Pretendians, Descendians, like frauds, fakes, like all that stuff. It gave them a bit of a framework to understand. Well, first of all, there's like cultural appropriation in things like art. And there's like, so it was like the whole gambit of the issue, not just, this person was a fake. So I think it gave Canadians a bit of a framework to understand, well, it's really a bigger issue. And I mean, you couldn't possibly cover everybody. You'd be here for the rest of your life, calling out all of the
and there's so many interesting aspects to it. Like one of the things we wanted to put in, we put in the first, second, or third draft, but the first edit, but it didn't really fit in. Is do you know Armand Garnet Ruffo? He's a prof at Queen's. He's from Temagami.
Okay.
And 25-30 years ago, he wrote that biography of Grey Owl, but through poetry and interesting prose, right? And 2-3 years ago was the 25th anniversary of that book, and his publisher was reissuing it, and he asked Armand if he wanted to do a new foreword for it, and he sat down and he did. And he, his view on Grey Owl has changed substantially in the last 25 years, because he says he's been talking with the people back home, and a lot of his family members and elders knew Grey Owl when he first arrived in Canada back at near the turn of the century. And his revision of it is the fact that he doesn't think it's cultural appropriation. He didn't think Grey Owl culturally appropriated Native culture, because he said you have this skinny, scared British kid, I think he was 19 or 20, getting off the train in the north, having absolutely no idea how to survive. They took him in, they taught him how to hunt, how to fish, how to trap. They taught him how to survive in the wilderness, and gave him the name Grey Owl. So basically, they culturally appropriated him. He wouldn't be where he was unless they taught him how to be who he was. And just a little while ago, unfortunately I missed it. Somebody was on a tour of I missed it at Trent, sort of explaining the slightly revisionist view of Grey Owl now. So there seems to be sort of an interesting
Yeah.
reinterpretation of the gray owl myth now.
There's just
Because
going to be so
all
many.
the native people knew he was white. It was the white people who were fooled.
Maybe that's one of the morals, but
Yeah.
okay. Well, we asked people before we started this to get their sweaters because the podcast forecast was going to be cold. And of course, I have got this one of a kind signed book
Well,
addressed to me.
you're not the first woman to call me cold.
Oh God. Oh God. Yes. Well, that's exciting. And so is this new book. And I know the listeners have been saying, so the listeners who haven't been able to get your book yet or haven't been able to hear you speak in person, because a lot of people reach out and say, hey, where is he speaking in person? And I was like, you know what? I'll ask him if he's got a schedule somewhere. Because I went on your website and you have, oh, and by the way, everyone, I will put this up here, but I'll also post the link to his website in the description box. He's got everything on his website, his publications, his awards. He's got a blog, what he's thinking about at the time, like everything you want to know about Drew Hayden Taylor, except maybe the R-rated stuff, that's on his website. There's no OnlyFans site there. So sorry for those of you, but is there somewhere where people can get a schedule, or is it just all they have to kind of find out through social media, like, oh, we're going to be in Ottawa
I
on
usually
this
put
day
it on
and this
Twitter X, though it's one of these things where I should put it on my website. There's it's one of these things where I've always been meaning to get around to it, but I forget about my website so frequently that it's like, oh yeah, I should do that.
Okay, well, there's his Twitter/X address, and the rest of us tried to share where you're going to be too. So if you follow Drew Hayden Taylor on Twitter, you'll be able to know what's going on. But I know listeners who say haven't had the book or heard you speak yet, they want the inside scoop. And I know there's like an official description from Penguin Random House Canada. Yeah, that's it. And it says that this book is a combination of many genres, which weaves a pulse-pounding and propulsive narrative. It was almost like this alliteration. I felt like Pam Palmater was coming right after that. But anyway, it sounds like it's both exciting and a bit scary. So for people
And
who know
funny.
nothing, yeah. So for people who know nothing, can you say what the genres of the book is and like what it's about?
All right, it's marketed as a horror novel, but it's a horror novel. There's comedy in it. It's a buddy book, whole bunch of different things. But its origins. All right, my very first novel, I decided to go to explore a European legend, culturally appropriated and indigenize it. So my very first novel was a native vampire novel called The Night Wanderer. My second novel, I decided to sort of flip it over and take a character from the indigenous cosmology and contemporize it. So I did. I took the trickster, Nanabush, and I contemporized him. I put him on a 1953 Indian Chief motorcycle, visiting a reserve in central Ontario and getting into mischief. And he looks like a white guy, so no one will recognize him. So I decided to take the trickster, put him on a contemporary reserve in the midst of summer and getting into mischief. So I decided to take that and flip it over. So I took another character from indigenous cosmology. It's wintertime, so I can say the word Wendigo. And I took him and I put him in an urban environment amongst urban native people in the city of Toronto, doing what Wendigos do, being, I guess, they're the one guy who is a native guy who was raised in a residential school and does not really know his culture that well, except through the legends. He's a university professor of Indigenous literature and storytelling, and slightly over the hill Indigenous hockey player are the two heroes in the book who end up going after the Wendigo. And as I said, it's supposed to be scary. It's supposed to be funny, and it explores literature. It explores urban life, a whole bunch of different things.
Oh, I was hooked as soon as you did the reading at that bookstore somewhere in Ottawa. I mean, I just loved it. I mean, you've got everything. You've got a creature from our traditional stories, which is really cool. You've got murder, mystery, thriller, horror, cops, all of these things all in one book. What on earth gave you the inspiration for this? I mean, more than just, oh, I'm going to, turn this around. Like, what made you think, okay, I'm going to write about this and it's going to be in this way and it's going to be a scary kind of book, but some humor in it?
Well, if you do a Wendigo story, it has to be scary. It's not a love story.
Yeah.
But I think the origins for this piece was the fact that I've known many traditional storytellers in my day, and I've listened to many traditional stories. Some of them are funny, some of them are scary, etc. And I just thought, I do remember a traditional storyteller once telling me that we need new stories as much as we need the old stories. So I decided to take that tradition of telling stories about creatures from our past and putting them in a modern environment. Sort of again, I keep talking about being a contemporary storyteller. This is one of the best examples of what I'm trying to do as a contemporary storyteller. Take characters from the stories our traditional storytellers told and telling them in a more contemporary way. And I mean, I did it with the trickster. I did it with the Wendigo, and it's I don't want to say it's easy, but it's not exactly groundbreaking. It's fun, and I think it also gives the youth a new way to perceive and explore traditional storytelling in our traditional characters, right? And one of the great things about this particular book is that when I gave it to Penguin Random House to read, they came back and they said they really, really liked it. There was only one problem with it. And I said, oh, really? What's that? And they said it needs a sequel. So they're hoping to do a whole series of these books. Their term was doing sort of an Indigenous X-Files.
Yes, I'm hooked already. I haven't even read the future books. They're probably not even out of your head yet. And I'm like hooked. Just keep writing, Drew. Keep writing.
I'm actually in the middle of another novel. I have nothing to do with this series. I'm just cleansing my palate, as we say, before I go in and do the second one. But I'm getting ready to do I'm going to probably work on the second one this summer.
So for sure. So all the people who are like, oh, some people speed read through these books as soon as they get them. They can read them in like 24 hours. I'm not doing anything. I'm just reading this whole book. The fact that there's going to be a sequel makes it even more exciting because then you read the book in a different way in the sense of what could the next book possibly be? And you're working on a different cleansing the palate novel now. Are you allowed to tell us a little bit about this,
or is it
like totally confidential?
No, this is going to sound so weird, but I am. A couple decades ago, I was asked to adapt and indigenize a 1930s Bertolt Brecht Kurt Weill musical from Germany, the 1930s, and for a Brecht in the Park festival. And I said, sure, I'd love to. Who are they? And because, as I said, I have no theater training, and I discovered they are very, very important in the development of musical and political theater in Europe. Because there's two types of theater, Aristotelian or Brechtian, one that makes you feel and one that makes you think. And so anyways, I adapted it, and it was produced, and it was one of the funnest things I ever did. And anyways, long story short, it sat on my shelf. I didn't get it published. It wasn't redone, produced anywhere because it's a full-scale musical. It's too expensive. But I always liked the story. I thought there was so much there that needed to be explored. So I thought, what the hell? It's there waiting to be adapted. The characters are there. The story's there. The environment, the issues are there. And it takes place in a casino on an Indigenous community. So it's about greed and all that sort of thing. So it's called Sucker Falls.
Nice. Which, if you think about casinos, and Sucker Falls and all of that other, I
Exactly,
mean,
exactly. And it's built
so
on a place where the suckers used to mate.
oh,
It's called a metaphor.
okay, we've learned something here today. When will this be out? 2025? Maybe?
Possibly. I have to finish it. I'm 30,000 words in. I'm hoping to get done by the summer. So then it would take
Oh,
about, what is it, 20? Yeah, about 2025. Hopefully, knock on wood.
huh. Is there okay, well, I'm looking forward to that because I feel like this metaphor is going to have to be unpacked.
I'm having lots of fun with it.
Yeah. Well, you are just like such an amazing person. The fact that you don't just do one thing. So you just don't write books, you don't just write novels, you don't just do screenplays, you don't just do TV, you don't like you're literally doing everything. I think that's so amazing because you really don't have a chance to get bored. You're like, "Oh, okay, if I'm done with the books now, I can work on this," or I mean, is that something you're just going to continue, like working in all of these different platforms, sharing your
So,
stories?
someone once asked me if I was going to retire, and I said, "Well, sure, I'll retire. Maybe I'll find time to write a book."
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
stories keep coming. The stories keep coming. Like I'm sitting here, I have, as you know, a couple of years ago, I had a book of Indigenous science fiction published, and it was bizarrely successful. And that publisher is saying, "Are you going to do another one? We'd like to really publish another collection of your Indigenous sci-fi." So I'm thinking
Yes.
I've already got 3 stories put aside for the next sci-fi horror fantasy book, and I'm like, got stories I want to do there. I got this. I just came up last month, just in one day. I was sitting around and I came up with the full structure to do another play. This one about Pretendians, and I'm just like,
Oh,
I got to find time to do that. It's just there's too many stories in this universe.
you're going to be like the native Star Wars or Star Trek version. And again, if you're not doing the video game, Pam Palmater has to be in the native sci-fi something. There must be a warrior in camo doing something that's cool in sci-fi.
I was going to do my version of The Walking Dead, and all the zombies would be band office employees.
You could make a whole show about that.
Exactly. Just going through the motions.
Oh, well, I love it. And for those of you who have not had this book yet, make sure the light's not shining on it here. You must get cold. You must but you also have to hear him in person. And like Drew, thank you for taking so much time to talk about your life works, and we've only like literally just scratched the surface, but some of the ways you think about this and how you've done it, because it just goes to show other people and youth who are listening there's 1,000 different pathways to get to where you want to be, and you don't have to do it the way someone else did it. There's lots of combos. So I really appreciate you sharing all of this and the fact that you can, just still have a sense of humor given, all of the issues that we face. And for all of the listeners, like if you have a chance to go listen to Drew, make sure you do, because he also does a book reading. So it's not just, hey, I'm signing my book. He does a book reading, which makes it even more enticing and you want to read it. And he takes time to answer your questions after the book reading, because even people like me and, I don't know, nobody's like Dr. Negon Sinclair, for example, award-winning journalist, hiding in the back of one of his book events in Ottawa, trying hard to think of trick questions for Drew. And just when we thought we had really hard questions for him, he turns it around and says, "Oh, Pam, here's a question from someone in the audience. Maybe you can answer it." And we were all like, what? No, we're answering the question. So be careful. It's a very engaging kind of book event. And if you haven't already, buy this book, buy all of his books. You definitely won't be disappointed. And for all of the Warrior Life podcast listeners, thank you for tuning into the podcast. And for those of you who check it out on the YouTube channel and either watch it, listen to it, or read the captions, however you engage with the Warrior Life podcast, thank you for supporting it. And I'll make sure that in both the podcast and the YouTube that I will post links to where you can buy Drew's book and his website and his Twitter, so you can kind of keep track of where he is. Don't stalk him, but you can keep track of where he is. And if you liked this episode, which I'm sure everyone is going to love because I already love it, and I've heard Drew speak already, and I was on a panel with Drew, and I'm still absorbed in everything he says. If you like the episode, consider subscribing to my podcast, maybe like hitting the like button, maybe share it, use it in your classroom, say in art class or film class or documentary class or, I don't know, writing class, and give the podcast good reviews. And if you want any information about any of this stuff, my website, which is very much no cool name, it's just pampalmater.com. You can check out my stuff there. You can access everything. And Drew, thank you again. I really do look up to you and your skill and everything you do and how supportive you are of the Native community. I really appreciate you.
Bueno, mucho bueno.
Mucho bueno. Merci beaucoup.
Derriere.
Oh, exactly. Until next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting my podcast. Your donations help me keep the Warrior Life podcast open access to everyone and free from those annoying ads. And it's super simple. Just click on the link below to sign up for a Patreon monthly or yearly subscription, or click the links for the Buy Me a Coffee app or the Ko-fi app to make one-time contributions. And if you belong to an awesome community group, business, or organization that's committed to Indigenous reconciliation, consider sponsoring an episode or two, or as many as you like. Thank you for helping me lift the voices of Indigenous warriors doing phenomenal things to help make our world a better place.